Good afternoon, everyone. We're live, and welcome to the complimentary live webinar sponsored by Sanlam in association with IPM. And IPM is short for the Institute of People Management. My name is Gershwin Brooks. I will be your moderator for today. And this is, of course, the retirement security and insurance amid COVID-19. How can employers and employees ensure financial resilience? Now, I'm pretty sure all of you will agree that COVID-19 is posing a major threat and major insecurities around people's incomes. And one of the things that I think statistics will always show is that usually when people go through a difficult period, one of the first things that tend to suffer is insurance, and all kinds of insurance that we talk about in this instance, whether it be short-term insurance, people's retirement annuities, or even life insurance. So generally speaking, that's the category of or the area or the space where we start to pay less attention to. But Sanlam recently conducted a research across a wide breadth of employers, retirement funds, and professional consultants to benchmark the employee benefits experiences of the lockdown, as well as their expectation of the future in a COVID-impacted economy. Now, the research intends to support all stakeholders across the employee benefit spectrum to make sense of the status quo and to explore how best to enable financial resilience and prosperity for their constituents in a rapidly changing world. And I'm sure everyone will agree the world has changed a heck of a lot. So on that basis, welcome to this webinar. Thank you for all the participants who are actually watching us live right now. I'm quickly going to introduce our speakers very quickly to you. And we, in the presence of two speakers from Sanlam. First and foremost, Dr. Matete Lerutla is the Managing Executive, Human Capital, Sanlam Corporate. Having started a career as a clinical psychologist, Matete's strength lies in coaching, influencing, and inspiring others to find meaning and passion in their work. She holds a doctorate in psychology, MSc in clinical psychology, a BA honors in applied psychology, and BA social sciences. Other professional development qualifications include an MDP from the University of Stellenbosch, Strategic Human Resources Management at Ashridge University in London, an MBA Essentials USB ED. She is a registered clinical psychologist with the Health Professional Council of South Africa and a member of the SABPP Master HR Professional category. I hope you're not going to psychoanalyze us during this discussion, Doctor. Viresh Maharaj is the Managing Executive Corporate Distribution at Sanlam. Viresh has been a member of Sanlam Benchmark Research Team since 2009. He is a fellow of the Actuarial Society of South Africa and holds an MBA from UCT Graduate School of Business. He is an outspoken proponent on the need for transformative change in the retirement funding industry with a specific focus on driving adaptability. And adaptability is exactly what we need right now. So for the participants, just very quickly, of course, you'll also have questions that you'd like to pose. So there's a chat function that Webinar Jam, the platform that we're using, gives us. So you can just, in the chat function, pose your questions. Just note that what will happen is both the good doctor as well as Viresh will be giving us a presentation. After that, we will then be referring to those particular questions. So start posting those questions immediately. There's a poll that will that's live now, and what matters most to employees is the question, and your options are cash flow, healthcare, insurance, retirement funding. And as I'm sitting here looking at the results thus far, cash flow is by far ahead at 73%, healthcare at 7%, 0% for insurance at this stage, retirement funding at 19%. And I think that's very telling. And then, of course, just below there, there's an offer which you guys can have a look at. Obviously, please do have a look at the offer as well. There's an offer there available. But with it, that's enough from me. I will be coming back to you with questions and facilitating the rest of the conversation. But immediately I hand over to Dr. Matete Lerutla to kick off proceedings with the presentation. Thank you. Over to you, Doctor.
Thank you, getting an echo. And to our listeners and everybody that has joined, a warm welcome. I hope that you find the conversation really meaningful and able to take something out of what we will be sharing with you. And trust you me, I am not going to psychoanalyze anyone. I remember back in the days, you know, when I qualified as a psychologist, typically when you walk around the room, people start, you know, being worried because they think you walk around reading their minds. And I always say, don't worry, I don't do it for free. You have to sit around the couch and pay me for me to be able to do that. But having said that, I'll just give a brief context around the role that I will play in this conversation. My colleague Viresh will go into details around the benchmark finding for 2020. And the theme of our conversation for Benchmark 2020 is individualization. And the reason we went with the theme of individualization is that the time has come as an industry for us to start looking at how do we actually individualize or customize the solutions that we are offering to our employees or to our constituencies. It is inevitable that the pandemic has really exposed the fault lines in a lot of things, and specifically in the retirement fund or in the employee benefit space that we are operating in, both as human capital professionals, but also leaders in the industry. So Viresh, maybe if you can just go to the next slide. So I think when we look at the retirement contribution and the impact of the market crash right now, imagine people who have been contributing to retirement for the rest of their working career, only to experience a blow in about 15 to 20% of their investment. It is something that is not nice. It's something that is traumatizing. And with that, we find people now also wanting to either defer their retirement or wanting to be reappointed in the industry back as fixed-term contractors. And we know very well that that on its own has got implications on some of the other broader strategic initiatives that we are having as an industry, as organizations in relation to transformation and all those other things. The other thing that we've noted is that much as retirement funding contribution is something that is well entrenched, and we actually make it mandatory for people that are entering the place of work, it is yet very sad to observe that less than 7 or less than 10%, about 7 to 10% of the people are able to retire comfortably. So that, of course, is something that really we need to be concerned about, because on the one hand, we do know that long-term planning is essential. I have noted on the poll that there's a 19% agreement on what is top of mind for people right now. But the reality is, it is important for people to also look at their long-term, savings as they contribute towards their retirement. So what all this suggests for us really is that there is a need for us as an industry to relook our offerings in terms of relevance. And that brings me to the next conversation around the cohort of the workforce that we currently have. So on average, I think my assessments, and I'm sure most of you would agree with me, that at least 75% of the workforce that we have in the organizations right now are ranging in age between 25 and at least 50. And if that's the case, they are your Gen X and your Gen Y generation, and we're beginning to see a small cohort of the Gen Z entering the place of work. So with that said, and what we know about this new generation, their needs are different. We've had these employee benefit, offerings and solutions that are entrenched, that have been in the market for decades. So, but we're having a new generation that is entering the workplace, and the dynamic of the workforce is also likely to change over time. The questions that we need to be asking ourselves is, how relevant then are the benefits that we're having to the cohort that we have in our organizations right now? And the other thing is, the younger generations tend to focus a lot on wanting to get information fast, quick, but also information that is relevant and meaningful to them at a point in time. So how often do we as HC professionals and as retirement fund, consultants, review the offerings that we have in relation to the type of employee profile that we have in our respective organizations. How often do we make sure that all our employees have got access to financial advice? I know we have spoken earlier on, or Gatchwell referred earlier all around all of us having a responsibility to build financial resilience, not only for our organization, but financial resilience for our country as well. But to what extent do we make sure that our employees have got a dedicated financial advice? Because the reality is, we have seen that a lot of people, when they leave from one employer to the other, it is high likely that they encash, their retirement contribution, therefore starting from fresh. So, however, what we've noticed as well is that those that have got access to financial advice tend to preserve and not really encash. And those are some of the things that we need to consider as part of ensuring that we provide holistic support, in terms of ensuring that people really retire comfortably, while at the same time balancing the need of what is important on a day-to-day need. The reality is that where we are now, people are struggling with multiple things. People have got multiple threats. There's threats around, am I going to still be employed? There's threats about, am I going to be able to afford, any emergency medical care? There is threats around day-to-day living. So people are sitting with multiple threats that on their own is causing a lot of strain in terms of both, not only financial strain, but also physical, mental, emotional, and the overall psychosocial well-being of our employees. So how do we make sure that in our offering, we create opportunities where the employees throughout their life cycles can have meaningful and purposeful, relevant solutions that will enable them to not only live in the here and now, but to also be able to retire comfortably when the time comes. Having said that, I'm going to hand over now to my colleague who's going to dig deep into the survey and give us findings around what we have really identified and in terms of the conversations that we've had with different stakeholders. Viresh, over to you.
Thank you, Matete, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Just on Matete's comment about being a psychologist and watching the reaction of people around her, I actually sit next to Matete when we're at the office. And when I did pick up that she did have this qualification, I must admit that I was watching her reaction to my interaction over time. So she hasn't left just yet. So hopefully that's a good sign on my side. But to everyone again, thank you so much for joining us today. This is a topic that we believe in and is an aspect of financial planning and financial resilience that we believe can make a meaningful impact on a broad range of South Africans in a financially inclusive manner. Now, as part of the benchmark research, we polled professional employee benefits consultants to have their views of what they see as the top trends in the retirement funding industry over the next 5 to 10 years. And you can have a look at their responses on the screen in front of you. What you find here is that the most popular responses, ranging from technological innovation through to a focus on members themselves, all speak to this trend of individualization, including the offer of an integrated suite of benefits as well as flexibility in benefit design. Now, this slide, as well as the handful of others that I'll show you today, form part of a much broader conversation that's derived from the Sanlam benchmark research. And I would advise that post the session, you do visit the website, and on the chat feature, the Mail and Guardian have directed you to the website, as well as via the offer tab as well. At the website, you'll be able to have access to a broad range of information, but drawn from the data and findings, and what you're about to see today is just a snapshot of those findings. So if we look at member behavior experienced during the lockdown, we find that about 25% of the professional consultants polled and roughly 25% of employers as well as retirement funds polled indicated that their members, their employees, had queried their investment values or their investment returns as a result of the market shocks that happened just a couple of months ago. And this is fully to be expected, given the dramatic change in asset prices and the huge amount of noise experienced throughout the industry at that stage. We had about 15% of respondents of employers indicating that they had employees or members of retirement funds who had actually requested access to their retirement funds to help provide a form of financial relief due to the economic constraints of the lockdown and the pandemic. You'd be able to cast your eyes over the findings on screen, and we go into this in a bit more detail in the actual research booklet itself. Now, this is where the impact of the lockdown can be demonstrated quite clearly. This represents the proportion of benefit consultants who have had clients request for temporary suspension in retirement funding contributions to provide an element of financial relief through to their employees, and 9 in 10 consultants have had at least a client which had done so. It gets more telling when we look at the funds or employees themselves. And at that stage, which was the 5th of June, just about a month and a half ago, about 25% of respondents, so 1 in 4 retirement funds or employers, had actually temporarily suspended retirement funding contributions. Now, this is telling because it means that the employers were unable to afford the contributions through to retirement funds and had to put a pause or a hold on those contributions. The net impact of this on average, based on average contribution levels and average pensionable salaries in South Africa, is a net increase of approximately 1,500 Rand per month in cash flow through to employees. Now, based on the findings of the poll, which hasn't closed yet, so please do vote if you get a chance, I think it's quite clear that cash flow is the main priority amongst most employees right now. The typical duration of these suspensions range from 3 to 6 months, with 3 months being the most popular. In our view, though, the majority of these short-term suspensions are likely to be rolled over in time due to the uncertainty around the return to normal in our economy. Investments obviously form a major part of retirement funding and planning. We go again into much more detail in the findings themselves, but a key issue which we want to surface in this conversation is around pre-retirement investment defaults. For those of you who engage in the employee benefit space and with formalized occupational retirement funds, it would come as no surprise that a lot of attention gets paid to the accumulation phase of life stage structures. Now, a life stage structure is an investment strategy that invests aggressively when an individual is younger, simply because they've got time on their side and have the time to make up for investment losses due to market volatility. And when they reach their early to mid-50s, they start getting invested into a pre-retirement default. And this is typically a more conservative portfolio that reduces their investment volatility, given that they've got less time in order to make up any potential losses. And this is a theory behind life stage structures, which form about 60% of the investment defaults in the market. Now, it's at this pre-retirement stage, just before an individual retires, that they're most at risk, simply because that is the most amount of capital that they've got invested and saved. And for the majority of employees, their retirement fund through their employer represents their single biggest source of retirement funding income typically. It's at this stage just before retirement that the opportunity to protect, create, or destroy value and wealth is greatest. And despite many portfolios being invested conservatively through a mix of different assets in a conservative manner, when market shocks happen, the fear creeps in and the market reacts in a similar manner. So despite being diversified, during a market shock, different asset categories tend to move together, and unfortunately, those movements tend to be downwards. And if you have the wrong retirement date, as individuals who retired just a couple of months ago would have experienced, this hits you directly. And it's because of this direct impact on pre-retirees that we find that about 13% of benefit consultants and 1 in 10 funds and employers are actually considering the introduction of smooth bonus or guaranteed type portfolios that provide an investment guarantee on one's capital so that you can never lose capital. We anticipate that interest in these types of structures will increase in time as participants and stakeholders in retirement funding come to appreciate the impact of volatility on pre-retirees as well as individuals purchasing annuities themselves. A keen question which we asked of the retirement funds and consultants was, how do you believe retirement funds can help to rebuild South Africa's economy? What you'll see on screen is the most popular option depicted in gray is to use South Africa's large pool of unclaimed benefits in order to beneficiate poorer communities through a range of mechanisms, potentially through the use of responsible investment structures with a focus on infrastructure development. The next three most popular options all relate to this principle as well, to invest in infrastructure, into alternative investments, as well as into ESG type investments, all targeted at enabling decent work and growth within South Africa's economy. Now, at the Benchmark Symposium held a couple of weeks back, we had a panel discussion made up of investment consultants, an asset manager themselves, the chairman of the Sanlam Umbrella Fund, and the chairman of Impact Investing South Africa. And you may access that recording via the Sanlam Benchmark website itself. Matete referred to financial advice, and in our view, high-quality financial advice has an empirically shown meaningful impact on financial outcomes. Yet, call it roughly 50% of respondents indicate that currently their advice strategy effectively boils down to not having an advice strategy in place. Because even when an individual is directed to speak to their own advisor, unless they've actually got their own advisor in place, individuals are left to their own devices and unfortunately tend to make poor financial decisions based on low levels of financial literacy in South Africa. To this end, we applaud the, call it roughly 40% of participants who indicated that they either make use of salaried advisors or have a panel of vetted advisors attached to their employer or retirement fund so that employees have access to quality advice. Now, Matete referred to millennials as a group, and we conducted research amongst a focus group of 25 to 45-year-olds, so squarely in the millennial bracket with a few at the fringes of that generation. And here we find that they tend to take retirement more seriously once they start to have their parents move into the retirement stage themselves. And once they experience the challenges of their parents trying to navigate retirement, they start to catalyze action and start to look for options in order to plan for their own retirement. A few key findings that popped out were that millennials want more than paper benefit statements. Receiving a letter in the post with their retirement fund values once a year is not good enough for them. They've requested access to advice because they don't know where to get it on their own, which again speaks to the role of the employer and fund in providing such access, and they require help with debt. It would come as no surprise that South Africa's consumers are highly indebted, and this plays a meaningful role in debilitating our retirement funding outcomes. I do want to move on fairly quickly now in the interests of time, but what you'll see here is a slide depicting the role that the digital revolution can play in South Africa's retirement funding sector. And in our views, the drivers of this revolution, which are reflected on the left of your screens, result in the outcomes which we anticipate on the right-hand side. And we believe that the market participants who are able to get those items on the left, the drivers right, and to do those exceptionally well, will deliver those outcomes far better than other participants. Matete, I'd like to hand over to you at this stage.
Yeah, no, thanks. Why do I always get a feedback? Just on the point around the millennium really waiting to observe their parents before they go on retirement. I guess before they start taking the retirement contribution seriously, I think it's interesting to note that according to actuarial calculations, you need to at least have contributed on average or minimum of 17.5% for a period of 30 to 35 years for you to be able to retire comfortably. And if people do not look and take care of the retirement investment earlier, they inevitably run a risk of not being able to retire comfortably. But having said that, I think what is important then, a takeout from what Viresh has said is, while the default regulation has really made compulsory, individual member support prior to retirement, I think we need to take individual support, member support throughout their career, throughout their employment very seriously beyond just what is required by the default regulation. So, and I guess the other point is, Viresh also mentioned that there is a possibility of recovery. So what we need to guard against during this time is people panicking and thinking that at this point retirement it's not necessary and therefore I'm not going to invest, because the truth is we all want to survive, you know, in terms of the immediate needs. But if we don't invest for the future, we're also possibly crippling, you know, the society in terms of they're having to have a lot of dependency on government at the time people go on retirement. So really my encouragement to us as human capital professionals and as leaders in the industry is let's take time to really review the existing assumptions and structures that we have to make sure that the benefits that we offer our employees remain relevant, you know, to the different workforce that we have. Thank you, Viresh.
Thank you for that, and thanks for the presentation that set out quite a bit of information in and around who the workforce is. I will just ask that we just minimize the presentation, and then we can maximize ourselves, and then people can actually see who we are and what we are up to. So I think my first question directed to both of you, and please feel free to volunteer, whoever's going to respond to this particular one, is there were two things that stood out for me immediately. Was the fact that you had a number of employees with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic that started querying the value of their investment value ultimately. And the second part is I saw that 15% request access to have access to those particular funds. So at the one end, the balancing act here that I find, and I think that's probably the toughest part for any person watching and listening to this conversation right now, is how do I balance the fact that one day when I turn 65, I need to have some money in the bank to be able to live and buy groceries and pour fuel in my vehicle, whilst now I'm faced with the real possibility of possibly a salary cut, possibly having lost my job, whatever the situation may be that has a significant financial impact, or even just simply the fact that I'm insecure and I'm not sure that I will be going back on Monday morning to the office and have a job. How does one reach that particular balance, and what is the responsibility of employers especially, and employees, I guess, in coming to some form of balance?
I think from my side, it's at this point where I believe helping the employees to be rational in the decisions that they make is quite critical. And that talks to the importance of employers making sure that they provide access as part of their employee benefit solutions to financial advice. Because the reality is you're making a very valid point. So we all have a need to survive right now, but it's like kicking the can down the road and hoping that, every time you get to a situation, you keep on kicking it, you're not solving the problem. So I think what we need to be aiming for is a rational, thought through, individualized way at which people can look at their financial well-being and resilience in a sustainable manner. Viresh, your view?
Thank you, Matete, and thank you, Gashwal. I think it's a challenge that many South Africans, in fact, not just South Africans, but many people around the world are facing right now. And it's an issue that we do address again at some length during the benchmark symposium itself. So once again, I do call on guests to go and view that. But the argument we made at that stage was that context matters. And the context of South Africa's current retirement funding regime is that we are here to provide the capability and platforms to build towards a good retirement outcome, but almost in isolation of an individual's broader financial needs. And that is a fault line in the way that our industry is structured historically. If we go back to the first retirement fund, in fact, which was started back in the late 1880s, it was actually in response to a societal need and political pressure to be able to provide a living income to individuals who were either too old or too sick to work. And at that stage in time, it was a revolutionary mechanism and became much more popular through the 19th and 20th centuries. And now we find ourselves here. And COVID has actually exposed the fault lines in our thinking around retirement funding, because the singular focus and effort placed on funding towards financial needs 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the line simply do not weigh up as strongly compared to the need for survival right now. And if we even refer back to the poll, which I'll do so again, I think it's quite evident where 2/3 of respondents indicate that cash flow matters the most, with just under a quarter indicating retirement funding. And I would suspect that those indicating retirement funding are probably more representative of the views of employees who are in their 50s or late 50s actually approaching retirement itself. Now, in this context, retirement funding in isolation will not solve for South Africa's problems, nor the challenges of working class South Africans. And that's where a holistic support system from employers can make sense, with step one being, how do we address the elephant in the room, which is debt management. Once we're able to sort out pervasive levels of consumer debt among South African employees, we can then start to address the issue of retirement funding and broader financial needs, which includes emergency buffer capital to help us through times just like these.
I mean, it's an interesting point that you raised there. I remember that once upon a time I was young and I thought I was invincible. And as you know, when one moves jobs or one moves between employers, then unfortunately you find yourself in that situation whereby you have the option of either taking your retirement funds and placing it with your new employer or whatever administrators with your new employer, alternatively spending the money. And unfortunately, I made that mistake many, many times in the past. And now in retrospect, you realize that inevitably, Gershwell, you're not immortal, you're not invincible. At some point, you are going to get to 65 and you will have to retire. And then how then do you look after yourself at that stage? And I think COVID-19 makes it even more difficult, or this period that we're going through COVID-19, because it could become very lucrative for people to look at those funds and to say, but I need the money now. Not taking it. And I think both of you had highlighted the fact, and especially you, Dr. Lerutla, the fact that you ultimately do have the responsibility, not just to yourself, but to the country ultimately, because all of us can't be living off of a social welfare system inevitably. But there's a couple of questions that came through, and I really appreciate the questions that have come through from the participants. Unfortunately, and you'll just indicate to me, because of course I'm not a professional in the space. I worked in the short-term industry many moons ago. But if these are questions that are more, should be directed more towards financial advisors, you'll just alert me to that. Solly Mateba asks a very interesting question, and I guess this paints the picture of how people are a bit worried about who benefits where. Who benefits from retirement fund investments? Is it the member or the asset manager? This is from Solly Mateba. Which I guess speaks to the need for people to make sure that they're the ones benefiting as opposed to someone controlling the money.
Well, thanks, Gershwell, and thanks, Solly, for quite an interesting question. I think this in itself is probably a day-long workshop to dig into the nuances. I think the answer, it actually speaks to a point Matete raised earlier. In our opinion, as Sanlam, and through the Sanlam benchmark research itself, we've demonstrated this. And Gershwell, you've touched on the point as well. The number one issue that's preventing more South Africans from achieving better retirement outcomes is the lack of preservation when individuals change jobs. Now, given that the average tenure of employment, or the median tenure, of employment in South Africa is about 4 years, it means that South Africans change jobs, call it every 4 years or so. And what that means is that you effectively reboot your retirement savings. So you've grown your asset base and you withdraw it, you pay the tax, and then you start from zero again. Now, it's in that context that an investment manager, while they would be earning fees while you're invested with them, they're not responsible for your final retirement outcome. They are responsible for the management of your money according to an investment policy statement and according to their mandates for the time that you're invested with them. As individuals, we need to take ownership on our retirement funding journeys and stay invested. And in doing so, we can then benefit from those investments. If we continuously cash out, then it's only the investment managers who benefit. If we stay invested, then to the largest extent, it is the individual member themselves who will benefit over the long term. Now, to that end, South Africa has introduced what's called retirement benefits counseling in various forms, from paper-based information through to human counselors who proactively engage and inform members of retirement funds of their options, as well as the tax consequences of cashing out, as well as the costs of doing so. And in taking that approach, in our own experience, we find that if you receive such counseling, you are 2.5 times more likely to stay preserved than if you hadn't. And that can make a meaningful difference over one's career.
Yeah, I think you couldn't have said it any better. I think I smiled when I looked at that question, because people tend to think that it is the asset managers that benefit, and yes, to a certain extent, and rightfully so, because they help us, invest in our portfolios in the right way. But it's very important for individual members to also understand that the retirement contribution is aimed at enabling their financial well-being at the time of retirement. And therefore, people need to take interest, firstly, in understanding the different portfolios that would work for them, but also making sure that they make the right decisions for their own investment. So, because if you don't make the right decision, it's like when you're having a house, but you are not looking after the maintenance of the house. So the minute you have an investment portfolio, you need to make sure that you feed the investment portfolio. You need to make sure that you maintain the investment portfolio. And in that way, if you keep on doing that, you will definitely benefit. So it is not a question of I am investing, but the asset managers are the ones that are benefiting. They are benefiting in a way because they're helping you invest, your finances in a way that that will give you the maximum returns. But it is still your responsibility to make sure that you act responsibly around the assets that you have.
Forgot to unmute myself. Great one there. Thank you so much. I'm going to combine a question and a comment by Suren Indul. His question is, why not let individual investment, or rather, why not let individuals invest directly and avoid paying financial advisor fees? And his comment there is, teach investment methods in school, be your own advisor. Is that sustainable, considering that, let's be honest, every now and again we have a new trend that hits the market. My social media pages, whether it be Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn, is inundated with everyone that wants to make me an overnight millionaire. But many of them are just trying to bleed dry my bank account. So is it such a good idea that all of us become our own financial advisors?
I think what is good is that we all need to be financially literate. I think the point is around how do we make sure that we're financially literate so that we can influence the direction of the financial advisors, to a certain extent, instead of us being passive. And also investing, retirement fund contribution should not be the only way that you invest. If there are other portfolios that you can expand on in addition to retirement funding, so be it. You can also opt for that. But my personal view is, investing through people that are specialized, it's easier. Yes, you can teach, people, but that's why we've got some people that are specialists and others that are not. However, it doesn't take away our responsibility to make sure that we are, literate around financial acumen.
So, Matete, I fully agree with you. I think you actually stole my opening statement there. In my view, and in engaging on this issue previously, I've advised individuals in various forums to upskill themselves so that they can have a meaningful and skeptical discussion with their financial advisors should they wish to make use of a financial advisor. Now, bearing in mind that financial advice does not only relate to investments, and there's a broad range of financial needs that one would typically engage upon when discussing one situation with a financial advisor, ranging from retirement planning to short-term investments, as well as insurance needs, estate planning, amongst various other factors. And for this, in order to properly implement an ecosystem that delivers a holistic spread of outcomes across the spectrum, one typically needs proper specialized financial advice, bearing in mind that if one goes to a mechanic, and hopefully a trusted mechanic, you rely on them to actually understand the the interplay of the various components of your vehicle and to fix it in a way and to structure it in a way that makes sense for you. It's not just about having a great engine. It's about having a vehicle that actually works. And your financial plan is your financial vehicle. Investments are a portion of it, but there's a lot more to it. That said, should an individual believe that they do want to invest directly, there are numerous platforms now available to South Africans to be able to do so, where they don't pay such financial advisor fees. The caution that we would have in that case is, if you go that route, you've got to do your homework and stay quite up to date with recent trends and developments, and you've got to have nerves of steel as well. When the market crash happened, call it 2 months ago, having someone to speak to provide an element of rationality and calm through that storm makes a meaningful difference. If one had cashed out at that stage out of panic, which happens, investors do panic, human beings do panic. There's nothing different across all of us around the world. If you had cashed out at that stage, you would not have then experienced the bounce that we've seen since then, and you would have locked in those losses. And that's where an advisor can play a key role as well.
I think interestingly, I just want to make an analogy that I like referring to, coming from a clinical environment, to say, you know, when you are in a multidisciplinary team, you've got a GP that needs to have a general understanding of the human body and the human psyche, and that's where you come in as an individual. But I wouldn't want a GP to extract my tooth at all, because that's not the area of specialty, because then you just run a risk. I just got reminded when Viresh made reference now to the mechanic. So it's important for us to understand how far can we go, but also how wise do we need to be around the assets that we really value the most. Because sometimes we tend to look at, this is what I can do, but you can actually cripple yourself, you know, in the long term. So there are people that are specialized in providing certain offerings and certain services in a trusted manner, and they're also governed, you know, in terms of their various regulations. So it's very important as well that you identify resources that will help you in the overall management of your own assets and finances.
Sorry, Gashal, Sorry, Gashal, just on the point of advice, I think Matete raised an important dynamic. In the same way that you've got doctors and mechanics, there's a range of capabilities and quality amongst financial advisors. To put everyone into the same pot is also inappropriate. You do have high quality financial advisors and you've got worse financial advisors. And the fact that poor advice can be given, it's not necessarily reflective of the industry, as would be the case whether it's medicine or for mechanics.
No, very, very good point there. I'm looking at the questions that have come through, and I just realized that I didn't give myself a proper introduction early on. I think I read your brief bios beautifully, but I am a freelance talk show host, especially with 702, and I've written on a couple of occasions for the Mail and Guardian and some other publications as well. In case people were wondering, who is this Gershwin Brooks fellow? You know, hosting this webinar. But I just wanted to make the point very quickly that generally when I do a radio interview, I don't tend to go for the jugular at the midpoint of the conversation. We either go for the jugular at the end of the conversation or at the beginning of the conversation, depending on who the guest is. But unfortunately, we've reached the midpoint and I'm going for the jugular now, courtesy of Adrian Janse van Rensburg, who asks, what about talk about prescribed assets? Now we'll add on to what Jan Kruger also mentioned there, because I think, and then you made the point early on, Bresh, that we have these pools of money that sound like a lot of money when you sit on the outside in terms of retirement funds and unclaimed funds, etc. How best do we put it to use? There has been much speak coming through from the state saying that, listen, we can actually tap into some of that money and assist, say, a state-owned enterprise, or assist with a project around infrastructure. How does that impact, and how does it make people nervous when it comes to the safety in particular of their investment funds, especially at a time like this when we are in a space of crisis and the state has to spend a lot more money than it ordinarily would in trying to provide some form of a buffer for citizens who do not have access to an income, let alone people who are even thinking about retirement?
Thanks, Gershwin, and thanks to Adriaan and Jan. I think that is a highly relevant topic. And while I'll try and answer it in a succinct manner right now, which won't do your questions justice, I would again refer you to the Sanlam benchmark reporting, which we have on the site, because in that panel discussion, the guests do go into the specific topic in a fair amount of detail, and I would recommend that you do and have a look. It's a 30-minute panel discussion, and it's highly worthwhile to experience it firsthand. So to butcher the actual discussion that was held 2 weeks ago, it is a valid concern, and I think there'd be very few working South Africans who have assets accumulated in their retirement fund who wouldn't immediately cringe at the thought of a bureaucrat now being responsible for their retirement outcome through the management of their own retirement savings through the mechanism of prescribed assets. And the engagement that various industry bodies, including ASISA, which Sanlam is a part of, have been having with various aspects of government, would be to explore the use of retirement fund capital in a responsible manner in a way that makes sense for retirement fund members as well as wider society. Unfortunately, there is no black and white answer here. The question we've got to address, or the challenge we've got to address, actually relates to the analogy you used at the outset of this Q&A, where you've got an individual who needs to meet short-term needs versus planning for a future retirement. I think the question that retirement funds and retirement fund stakeholders are now grappling with is that the reality of our country right now is the reality of it. And while we can all point to the drivers of where we are right now as an economy and as a society, the question that we also need to ask is, what can we do to ensure that the situation improves? What type of country do we want our children to grow up in? And as a nation of retirement fund members, what type of society do we actually want to retire into? And what role can we play? Because to put it bluntly, it's you could have the best investment returns in the world. Unless you're planning on retiring somewhere outside of South Africa, then South Africa's future is of no concern. Except that the vast majority of retirement fund members will actually be retiring in South Africa. And having a big sum of money at that stage actually has to mean something. Does that money actually carry value? Does the rand actually make sense 10, 20 years down the line? And are you retiring into a country that is secure, has infrastructure, has social solidarity, is safe, has all of the good things that we're after? And can you build towards that through the allocation of your capital? Obviously, the trust deficit that sits for the obvious reasons between retirement funds, the private sector, and the public sector in various ways needs to be addressed. And we would like to think, and we've definitely seen momentum in this direction, that the parties are coming closer together with a view to improving governance. And I think that's the key message. How do we enable better governance to provide trust to providers of capital, such as retirement funds, that monies will be allocated appropriately and responsibly?
You were concerned that you wouldn't be answering the question in full, but I think it's a beautiful answer. I mean, it makes absolute sense. And that is what makes this a balancing act ultimately. I mean, going back to sort of the horse that we're flogging to death and then bringing back to life and flogging again. The fact of the matter is the balancing act throughout. It's all great and wonderful that you have a retirement fund that's safe and can look after yourself and probably the next generation, but it doesn't necessarily help if that fund and you find yourself in a situation whereby you're living in a country that's, going back to the car analogy, standing on bricks. It doesn't then help anyone. So it is a very tough balancing act. But Joe Kutzer has an interesting comment that he makes here. He says, I think people need to understand that they have to take ultimate responsibility for their own retirement savings. However, being people seem to find reading documents and doing some basic research and coming to a position of understanding too much effort, We make available to members a panel of accredited advisors, but the uptake is dismally low. This seems to indicate that members are abdicating the responsibility. This is extremely worrying. Now, I'm just going to add on a little spice to that question. And this is something I've noticed in the office as well. What happens is that the retirement fund advisors would come through, they'll organize a bit of an indaba prior to COVID-19, of course, before we needed to socially distance from each other. They'll probably bring some teas and coffees along, and they'll take you through what your portfolio looks like, what on average has been happening. But generally speaking, there's a very low uptake and very little, I don't see people being engaged and interested in that conversation. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is it because people are disengaged and they couldn't care less on the one end, or on the other end, could it be a case of at times people find the stuff really complex, really intimidating, really scary? And guess what? That is what I have a financial advisor for anyway.
Yeah. So my sense is, talking about finances, it's not an easy conversation, especially if your financial standing is not great. It's quite threatening because people would rather defer talking about something that is not pleasant in the midst of making sure that I look after my happiness right now. And it's a combination of, I really don't want to touch this subject now. I know it's an important subject, but I really don't want to touch it. And therefore, people disengage consciously from having those conversations because they are threatening. I think the other thing, somebody earlier made a point around financial literacy and how do we make sure that people really understand the investment cycle. We've got a responsibility as a society to make sure that this type of conversations start early in childhood. So it's a curriculum in the early foundation phase where learners are educated around economics and the importance of financial savings so that we don't wait until it's late. But also in our households, I mean, to what extent do we as families sit around the table and talk about financial management so that we can make it easier for people to engage on subject of financial strain or financial unpleasant conversations when we get to the place of work? So I think we need to start humanizing the reality and saying, unless we start talking about the stresses, they will not go away. And the sad thing is that the more we don't talk or the more we don't engage about it, the more people defer from making the right calls around their financial investments.
Thanks, Mateo.
I knew that we were going to get to a point of psychoanalysis. Thank you, good doctor.
I didn't mean to do that, and it wasn't that at all.
You should see what it feels like to sit next to her. Now, look, I think you raise important aspects. So dealing with the latter challenge which you raised, the financial services industry tends to be quite exclusive for various reasons, including the language that we use and the implicit complexity of many of the decisions that need to be taken and the sophistication of the outcomes of those decisions and the need to explain those outcomes in quite clear detail as required by legislation and regulation. It's not, so to put it in context, I'm not a financial advisor. I happen to be an actuary with a number of years of experience. I cannot give you financial advice, whether I can explain it well or not, simply because I'm not registered to do so. And providing financial advice means that you need to take someone through quite a process and to explain a number of things in a fair amount of detail, which is hard to do in a one-page brochure. And given the velocity of information and our consumption of information these days, the typical South African, including all of us, we don't want to have to go through that. When's the last time any of us have read a range of T's and C's? And only when those T's and C's hit do we then throw a fit and try and get some form of resolution. That's in no way trying to pass the buck onto the consumer, but The industry itself has been undergoing a transformation process in order to explain matters in plain and simple language, has been adopting the principles of treating customers fairly over a number of years, and that is evolving over time as different regulation and the application of that regulation comes into play. That said, the ultimate responsibility rests with the individual because we are funding for retirement under what's known as a defined contribution environment. In this context, myself as the individual, I've got to take ultimate ownership of my own decisions. And while I'll have support from my employer, the trustees, financial advisors, retirement benefits counselors, I still need to make better financial decisions. And unfortunately, for most people, until they hit their early to mid-50s, retirement funding is something that happens to old people and is not something I need to worry about until a later stage in my life, which is understandable. I mean, there's very few people that would proactively in their 20s start planning for their retirement 40 years down the line. It's unrealistic, and that's why occupational retirement funds by default start that process. And for those of us fortunate to belong to such funds, without making any form of decision, we're already on the right path. Our responsibility is to stay on that path, despite not necessarily being interested in doing so.
A very important point that you're raising. I'm just quickly going to go to one last comment. We'll have less than 4 minutes left, so I'll give you each a minute just to wrap up very quickly. Boitoko Raritladi saying we really need to have a module in an employment platform to educate the employees on retirement and the importance of it. I'm looking at this from the learning and development perspective, as I'm working as a learning and development specialist. I guess perhaps Dr. Lerutla, that's a space, especially coming from a human resources space, a human capital space. There is something that's needed where people just need to up their understanding or their skills level or their knowledge around these issues. Just very quickly, I'm going to go through the poll results one last time. What matters the most to employees? Cash flow standing at 66%, just under 2/3. Healthcare at 6%. Insurance has crawled up to 2%, and retirement funding to 24%, which I think speaks volumes to much of the conversation that we had this afternoon. Dr. Lerutla, I'm going to give you the floor first to wrap up our discussion.
Yeah, no, thank you for that comment around continuing our responsibility to enable a better understanding around our finances. And most importantly, when you are doing that, let's do it in such a way that it's fun, in a simplified way, and in a non-threatening manner as well. And let's do it in such a way that it will create a pull instead of a push. Because what is important also is let's engage with our workforce and understand what components of employee benefits or retirement funding they would like to understand, so that we don't go and impose what we think they want. We've got a responsibility to engage, solicit their input so that we remain relevant. And by doing that, not only are we going to educate, but we can also influence, organizations that are partnering with us in terms of employee benefits to make sure that we become relevant in the offerings.
I can't really add or dispute anything that Mateta's put on the table. So perhaps in closing, and to everyone who's joined us today, thank you. I see there are a number of comments, which we'll try and address offline as well. My call to each of you and the positions of influence that you do hold is to pause and reflect and take stock of where we are right now, and to use the data and insights available freely to yourselves from the Benchmark website to help your constituents and your stakeholders to pause and reflect and to potentially make different decisions that help more of your constituents to achieve greater levels of financial resilience. The situation we're in is one that affects all of us in different ways, except for one uniform measure, and that is that it affects all of us. So to the viewers today, thank you so much for joining us, and I'd like to hand over back to our host.
That is, if the host can unmute. Well, all I can say is thank you so much. It was a really informative discussion. I didn't think that one would have so much fun talking about two dreaded things, that is money and the lack thereof, and getting older and having to retire one day. But it was an absolutely stunning conversation. I want to thank both Dr. Matete Lerutla as well as you, Viresh Maharaj, for adding value to this conversation. Of course, just one last reminder to the people watching still, this was a complimentary live webinar sponsored by Sanlam in association with the Institute of People Management. I hope you gained a lot of insight and a lot of information and valuable insights into retirement. And I guess it's one of the toughest things that any person is faced with, because guess what? It is for an uncertain future. People will tell you, how do I even know I'm going to make it to the age of 65? Well, guess what? You get to 65, your employer tells you that, well, don't come back on Monday, and you will need something in the bank account at some point or the other. So thank you, both of you, and thank you to everyone that has participated. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all the questions, but that's how these conversations go. Have a nice day and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ashok.